Hello there, everybody. Dr. Keith with another in my occasional expert interviews, and this time with a wonderful, absolutely wonderful. She's a celebrity in her own right. She's got to be the most attacked doctor in history. That will immediately commend it to all of you out there. I know that. I don't think even Ignaz Semmelweis probably got hammered more than you have. She's been attacked over 40 times. She's going to tell us the story in a minute. Anyway, this lady's name is Sarah Myhill. Sarah, thanks for coming to talk to us, darling.
My pleasure, Keith. It's nice to see you again. We go back many decades between us.
Many, yeah, 80s, wasn't it? Well, we called ourselves clinical ecologists in those days, didn't we? Then we realized all sorts of taxi drivers and school teachers were also taking on the title, so we shifted somewhere. Anyway, it's still around, isn't it, that society? What does it call itself now? Because I've not been a member for 20 years. What is it?
It's now the British Society for Ecological Medicine.
Ah, okay. Well, that kind of works, I guess. But of course, our old crony, well, my old cronies anyway, are all gone. You know, Ronnie Finn and I can't remember their names now. But anyway,
Jonathan Maberly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, John. Yeah.
Honor Anthony.
And
Keith Eaton.
Yeah, wonderful. We were talking the other day, and I couldn't remember her name. It was Hugh Cox, of course.
Yes, Hugh Cox.
And,
yes,
and
exactly.
it was High Wycombe was the town I couldn't remember either.
Yes.
I think I'm getting a bit senior down. I'm 78 in a few weeks. But anyway, there were quite a crowd. These were wonderful people in the old days. But you've emerged from the pack as the one most hated by Big Pharma. You have to be brought down. They're after you. Anyway, tell us some of this. I mean, we don't want all 40 attacks, but 40 odd. But you've been hammered over and over, haven't you? They really want you out of the way. What are you doing that's so wonderful that they want to get rid of you?
Well, as you know, I did 20 years in NHS practice with no problem whatsoever. And then I found I didn't have the clinical freedoms that I needed to be an effective doctor when I was working NHS practice. Indeed, I got my wrist slapped because my prescribing budget was so low that obviously made me a bad doctor.
Right, that's why Hugh Cox came up, wasn't it? Because correct. They were complaining. He saved the NHS tons of money. And they hated that. Well, it's Big Pharma, isn't it?
Correct.
They want the money. You know, I've often said, what's the point of having a nationalized medical system if you don't nationalize the drug industry? Because it means the taxpayers are then fattening the coffers of private corporations via the drugs. And they seem to love it. And talk about lucky. Sorry, interrupted. Carry on.
So in 2000, I went into independent practice. And that's when the attacks started. Now, there's never, ever been a complaint from a patient. All the complaints either come from other doctors who don't understand what I'm doing, or health authorities, or the GMC itself. And the GMC also accept anonymous online complaints from people who are clearly trolls who just dislike what I do. And for all I know, it may well be Big Pharma backed.
I should think so, yeah.
As a result, I've been endlessly prosecuted by the GMC. The current score is Myhill 38, GMC nil, with 5 cases outstanding. And I have another hearing in November.
Oh, I really feel, I had a couple of those, of course. Anyone steps out of line is going to get hit. And it's terribly stressful. So I wish you well with it, darling. I mean, I want you to be like 43-0.
Well, I'm confident it will be. Yeah. And one of the best things that happened to me is that after my first hearing, the insurance companies refused to cover me for GMC hearings, which meant I've had to conduct my own defence.
Oh, Lord,
and A, that's been very cheap because it's just me that's doing it. And B, it means I can really speak my mind and really say what I think. And that, of course, the GMC hate more than anything else because they're not controlling me in my defence.
Yes, that's wonderful to stand up for you. I've voiced a few feelings myself. One guy, I can't remember the question now, but I said, "Are you being facetious, sir?" And he said, "No, I'm serious." I said, "Well, it sounds like you're being facetious," but my answer is, these are just, they're dinosaurs. That was the word you used, wasn't it? They're way past their sell-by date.
And indeed, just recently, literally within the last week, the British Medical Association has put through a vote of no confidence in the GMC and have demanded that its leadership be entirely changed.
Yes, and preferably buried while they're at it. I should explain, because they've got a large number of American followers, Israel around the world. GMC is the General Medical Council, and that's what supposedly is a regulatory body for doctors. Now, in America, you lose your license if you don't like it, but in England, we call it being struck off. And you're in a register of allowed doctor practitioners, and if you get struck off, they put a line through your name, and you're no more. And they've utterly failed to strike Sarah off, as you can see. In fact, didn't you have a QC, or it'd be now a KC friend, who's got so maddened by this stupidity that he came to your rescue, knight in shining armour and so on?
Yes, bless him. There's one hearing, a non-compliance hearing, where I refused to release my patient's notes to the GMC. It demanded that I should, and there's a whole week's hearing about this very issue. And the bottom line is I won. Thanks to Mr. Charles Taylor, who was incredibly helpful. He argued the legal case because patient confidentiality is absolutely central to the doctor-patient relationship. And if the patient says to me, no, you cannot release your notes to the GMC, then guess what? I cannot release those notes to the GMC. It's part of the Hippocratic Oath. So the GMC have been failing patients for decades because they've been taking their NHS medical records without patient knowledge and without consent.
Well, they took the hypocritical oath, remember, not the Hippocratic. Yeah, but anyway, there were good times, weren't they? 80s and 90s, where we really felt we might even win. We were going around I used a slogan like, I want to see an end of alternative medicine. I don't want any alternative medicine. I want what we do to be the only medicine. And if you want to do drugs, clear off out of my space and go and get some. I don't do drugs. And that kind of, yeah.
And I believe the same too. But what we didn't reckon with was the power of Big Pharma. Yeah. And Big Pharma not only educate the doctors, in fact, they don't educate them, they brainwash them. They also control the regulatory bodies. We now know that the British, that the General Medical Council, the medical MHRA who regulate our medicines, these are all in the pocket of Big Pharma. And that's why medicine now today is so corrupt.
Right, and you're fighting billions. We are just the peasant farmers of doctors, the economy, aren't we? So, what seems to be happening, Sarah, and I know you'll agree, is that they're taking down. There are free spirits out there, and I often say there are good doctors out there. There are honest scientists. There aren't many, but they're out there. But they're being taken down one by one. Paul Marrick that used vitamin C for ICU sepsis cases with brilliant results. He's gone. They just squeezed him out. We don't want vitamin C. It's pennies on the dollar. And that's what they're doing. And I'm gone. So I retired long ago from physical practice in medicine. So they're not particularly after me. I've got to be a bit careful, of course. But you're right in the frame, and I'm sorry to hear it. But anyway, good luck with that. Now, let's get down to business. I want to talk with you. You're my sort of class expert on the subject of post-viral fatigue syndrome, as we used to call it. It became known as ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis in Britain and Europe. The Americans call it fibromyalgia. They can't get anything right. They've got to change all the words. Thiomersol, which means, mercury, sulfur, dissolved, soluble. They change it to, what's it called? Thimerosal or some weird word. They can't get anything right. But anyway, so we've got post-viral fatigue syndrome. We've now got long COVID, which is the same thing, but they want it to be different so they can come up with a whole new panel of drugs. Of course, we're now investigating long COVID, and you know what's going to happen. They're going to bring out a rash of official drugs that are deadly expensive. And anyway, the point is that a person can do a lot for themselves, can't they? So this is why I'm talking to you now. One of the big breakthroughs or forward milestones in this story has been the recognition of the power and the importance of mitochondria. I think most people, even lay people now, have heard of mitochondria, and they've got some vague idea these are the energy organelles that are within our cells. Talk us through this. Why it seems logical, but why would this lead to a loss of energies?
Before I can talk about mitochondria, I just want to step back for one sentence, because the key point to recognize is that what you are talking about are not diagnoses, but they are clinical pictures. So long COVID is a clinical picture that occurs, that's triggered by a COVID infection or a COVID vaccine. Post-viral fatigue syndrome, again, is the fatigue that follows a viral infection. ME, ditto. So you just have to break down.
I used to say that as well. I used to say irritable bowel is not a diagnosis. Irritable bowel is a symptom.
Correct. Arthritis is not a diagnosis. It's a clinical picture. We always have to ask the question why. We have to look at the mechanisms. Now, as you probably know, my special area of interest is chronic fatigue syndrome and ME. Now, chronic fatigue syndrome is the clinical picture that arises where there are poor energy delivery mechanisms. ME is the clinical picture that we see when there are poor energy delivery mechanisms and inflammation. And that inflammation may be driven by allergy, autoimmunity, or chronic infection. But let's start with chronic fatigue syndrome, because mitochondria are central here. And to explain to my patients, the analogy I like to use is the car analogy. You know, our body is a sophisticated machine, but it works a little bit like a car. And for our car to go, you've got to have the right fuel in the tank. And that's all about diet and gut function. You then have to have the mitochondrial engine, and that engine takes fuel and oxygen from the bloodstream to generate energy. And then those mitochondria have to be controlled by the thyroid accelerator pedal, without which mitochondria go slow, and the adrenal gearbox. And the adrenal gearbox allows us to step up energy generation in response to stress, whatever that stress may be, physical, mental, emotional, financial, whatever. So that's what I call the roadmap. That's the overall strategy. And as you rightly say, mitochondria are central to that. These are the engines. And this is the question I started to ask in the early 1990s, because in the 80s, it was all about allergy and nutrition and detox regimes. And I got, many patients, better, but not well. And I thought to myself, there has to be a piece of this jigsaw puzzle missing. And there was a very wonderful collaboration with Dr. John McLaren Howard, who really should receive the Nobel Prize for biochemistry.
John is brilliant, isn't he? Oh, gosh, what a man. Yes.
And I put to him this difficult question. John, I think that, there's a mitochondrial element to patients with fatigue syndrome. What do you think? Can you develop a test? And of course, being the brilliant man that he is, yes, he did develop a test. It's called ATP profiles. He no longer does this now, but Professor Koenig in Germany has taken up his work, and she does this at Armin Laboratories. But I had collected by then 71 patients who had got so far and got stuck. John had the test. And so we did mitochondrial function tests on all those 71 patients. Now, I saw the patient and we agreed a clinical score. The bloods went down to John McLaren Howard. He didn't know the clinical score. He did the tests. And the results were independently sent to Professor Norman Booth from Mansfield College, Oxford, who did the number crunching and wrote the paper. And we published in 2009. And what this showed is that those patients who had the greatest fatigue had the worst mitochondrial function, and vice versa. It was the first solid, objective laboratory evidence that mitochondria are centrally important in patients with fatigue syndrome. And that's what prompted me to write my first book, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. It's mitochondria, not hypochondria. And of course, that went down very well with all my patients.
Yeah, I love the title, because that was the big thing, wasn't it, back in the 80s? They got such abuse, these poor guys. One smart ass wit said, there's nothing wrong with these people. All they need is antidepressants and a good pair of running shoes. Well, we know. Well, actually, I don't recall it reading, but I know because it's true that the picture is also that exercise really whacks these people out, doesn't it? It's like they're allergic to exercise. Silly expression, but a bit like that. Yeah.
Well, the point here is that we all get tired at the end of the day. And by the next day we are recovered. Now, the difference between that normal fatigue and what I call pathological fatigue is the delayed element. So if the chronic fatigue syndrome patients don't pace their activities very carefully, they pay for it the next day, and that obviously makes them worse. It slows their recovery. So, we all have a certain bucket of energy that we have available to spend, and a normal amount of energy means we can live a normal life. But if that bucket of energy is small, for the reasons we've discussed, diet, gut function, mitochondrial function, thyroid or adrenals, if that bucket is small, then that person simply doesn't have the energy to spend. And again, there's another very important thing to understand here. We have a bucket of energy available to us. If we spend more energy than is available, then we die. We die because there's no energy to power the heart, the brain, the gut, whatever. And so to stop us spending that bucket of energy, the body gives us symptoms. And those symptoms are extremely nasty. If they weren't very nasty, we'd go on spending energy until we drop dead. And those symptoms include pain. And that pain is manifest by lactic acid. Now, just to explain what lactic acid is all about. Normally, when we are making energy efficiently in our mitochondrial engine, we burn fuel in the presence of oxygen, and we produce a lot of energy, between 32 and 36 molecules of ATP. It's a very efficient way of getting energy. If our mitochondria go slow for whatever reason, and we'll come on to that, and the body is demanding energy, we can make energy temporarily by anaerobic metabolism, without oxygen, by fermenting fuel. Now, the problem with that is, yes, you can make energy, but not much. You can make 2 molecules of ATP, and compare that to, with oxygen, 36 molecules of ATP. So it's incredibly inefficient. Now, in doing so, you generate lactic acid. That's the byproduct. Lactic acid is extremely painful. It's what stops athletes winning gold medals. In my fatigue syndrome patients, it gives them severe chest pain, fibromyalgia, muscle pain, and so on. To get back the lactic acid, to convert it back to pyruvate, where it came from, now that costs 6 molecules of ATP. So when we go into anaerobic metabolism, as we push ourselves to our limit, it's temporary gain, but massive midterm pain. And it's like borrowing money from a loan shark. So I use the money analogy when it comes to ATP. ATP is like money. And with that bit of money, you can buy any job in the body, whether it's conducting a nerve, contracting a muscle. But if you use ATP anaerobically, it's like borrowing money from a loan shark. You're paying it back at 300% interest. And the interest has got to be paid in minutes.
Right.
So getting into lactic acid is very bad news. It's very counterproductive. It might be a life-saving intervention if you're sprinting away from a saber-toothed tiger, but the fatigue syndrome patients are constantly pushing themselves to their limit because they have to get stuff done just to exist, don't they?
Yes.
They're constantly going to anaerobic metabolism. They're constantly in pain. They constantly have this delayed fatigue, and that slows their whole recovery and drags them down. So the first thing they have to know, or they have to learn, is the importance of pacing. It's very boring, but if you don't pace, you will take much longer for you to get well. So that's always the starting point.
Right. And of course, this is contrary to advice from most ignorant doctors. Pull yourself together is the usual treatment, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with you, really. Just get on with it. Just do something. And I've got that stupid, simplistic view that if you just work and push, it'll come to you as if you were some sort of super athlete. But of course, they're not. Anyway, tell us, how do we get mitochondria going? This seems to be very essential. You have a regimen. I was fascinated to read it.